Ambassador Ruben E. Briggity, please bring your panel onto the stage. It'd be really great to have you here. What is the link between global youth livelihoods and also agriculture? There's a link that connects your young farmer in Nigeria, your young farmer in Nebraska, and the ambassador and his panel will make that connection. Thank you so much. Looking forward to it.
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. My name is Ruben Briggity. I'm Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs. I must say, I feel like I need a booster seat for these chairs. They're really quite deep. But we're delighted to have you all participate in this conversation, connecting the local to the global, a catalyst for improving livelihoods. Now, we all know that at the turn of the 20th century, it was young farmers that were deeply involved in experimenting with new seed grains and new farming techniques that really did help to propel American agriculture, not only as a matter of feeding the United States, but also as a real export sector for our economy. And then towards the middle part of the 20th century, it was more institutionalized groups like the 4-H clubs or Future Farmers of America. I think I see one FH Future Farmer here in his distinctive jacket, that helped to continue to invigorate and bring young people into the agricultural sector here in the United States. But we also know that now, as we sit on the firmly at the beginning, moving beyond the beginning of the 21st century, the average age of farmers and ranchers in the United States continues to grow. And younger people are not as involved in the agricultural sector as their grandparents were, 2 generations ago. And also in other parts of the world, in Africa, where I spend a fair amount of my time, we also know on the one hand that agriculture and agribusiness is the quickest way to create large numbers of jobs for young people, but also we know that an awful lot of young people would much rather be involved in other sectors rather than agriculture. So the question is, what can we learn on both sides of the Atlantic, for the farmers in Nebraska, the farmers of Nigeria, and in particular the young people on both sides of that divide, on how we can continue to get innovation and new thoughts and new energy amongst young people, young farmers, young ranchers. And we have an amazing panel here to help us walk through these questions. To my far left is President Zippy Duval, who is the president of the American Farm Bureau. Next to him, we have Ms. Kelsey Ducheneau, who is Youth Programs Coordinator for the Intertribal Agriculture Council and also a co-lead farmer in South Dakota from the Farm Journal Foundation. Next to Kelsey, we have the Honorable Doug Beereiter, who's a former member of Congress from Nebraska. And then immediately next to me is Ms. Amy Alexander from the University of Arkansas. So we're just going to kick off the conversation with a few questions. And so for all of you in the audience, please get your questions ready. And after we've gone through the panel, we look forward to a dynamic conversation with everybody else. And Doug, if I may, and I'm going to call everybody by the first name, because we're all old friends, having met backstage a few minutes ago. So Doug, if I can start with you. The United States has played a leadership role in food and agriculture and nutrition for over a century. But just because we've always done things a certain way doesn't necessarily mean we need to continue to do so. So from your perspective, why is it important for the United States to continue to play a leadership role, not only domestically, but abroad in this space?
The short answer, I think, is because it's in our national security, it's our economic interest, and because we have humanitarian instincts in this country that we need to follow through. Now, there are lots of reasons, but I want to narrow down to about 5, and I'm going to use a mnemonic device to help me remember. So EIMLA. E means economic opportunities we need to provide for this huge youth bulge that's out there. Otherwise, it leads to extremism, to recruitment to terrorism, to gangs, to social instability. So that's a good E, I think. And I is related to something a previous panel already covered. It's a lot less expensive, as Robert Gates and others, military leaders have said, to provide humanitarian relief, to provide economic opportunities through our programs and efforts than it is to have military intervention. A lot less expensive in blood and treasure. Third M, we heard something about the fact that food insecurity And lack of economic opportunities leads to huge migrations, cross borders in some cases. The first decade in this last century, this century, about 3.1 million people annually moved from lesser developed countries to developed countries. You know how big this problem is in Europe today. And we see that has happened in a number of cases in North Africa, in Syria. Several examples were mentioned, and I saw it firsthand leading the Asia Foundation in Southeast and South Asia when they had food hikes in 2008, 2009. Unnecessary spikes, by the way, caused by export embargoes. Next would be leadership. You know, if the United States doesn't provide the leadership, as it has frequently since World War II, on food security and development activities, it just doesn't get done by the international community. It was the Feed the Future initiative that was given to the campaigns of McCain and Obama, and the President Obama picked it up. It became his major first foreign policy objective at the G20 and the G8. And it led to an international effort that involves governments and NGOs across the world, as well as the international development institutions. So that's important that we continue to provide that leadership. And finally, I'd say that's affinity. We want to demonstrate to young people and to people in general in lesser developed countries that we have their interests. We are interested in making food security possible and economic opportunities. And they're more likely then to have an affinity for our institutions, for our values, for our democratic systems, and perhaps our commercial interests as well. Furthermore, we need support on international and foreign policy objectives. We're more likely to have that if we are good neighbors in this global environment.
Doug, thanks very much for that. And Kelsey, I was wondering if you could build on that in this sense, because obviously the United States can't be a leader in agriculture unless we're actually growing stuff, which we are, which is good, fortunately, as you know, as a young farmer yourself. But we have a bit of a paradox. And on the one hand, our agricultural sector is the most efficient it has ever been historically. And yet we also conversely have the fewer number of farmers as we ever had historically. So you are on that cutting edge of the next generation of farmers. And I'm wondering from your perspective, what is it that you see as essential for farms to continue to exist and grow and thrive in this global economy? And what are you worried about in terms of things that may make your job more difficult?
Thank you. I'd like to first thank, move my mic up here, the Chicago Council for Global Affairs for giving an opportunity for so many stakeholders in our future to come to the table and across so many different sectors and to talk, and then to allow me, a farmer, to be a component in that discussion. That really means a lot to me. And I'm excited to see this holistic approach to agriculture, pulling in nutrition and animals and the environment. And really, I think we need to kind of redefine how we look at us being the most efficient, because there's always more progress that can be made. There's locations within the United States that can still improve and come up to par with that efficiency across the board to continue to share our resources around the world to end hunger. As the youth programs coordinator for the Intertribal Agriculture Council, it's really hard for me to not be optimistic. I see the emphasis that gets put into ag research and extension, and the impact that it has for young people who are getting involved in agriculture. We are able to improve our lands, to implement conservation practices that haven't been done for decades. We're able to lower that age gap. We're targeting the issues that are at hand, and we would not be able to do that if it wasn't for the ag research and extension that exists. I feel like as long as we are able to utilize the technologies on our phones to improve our yields in our crops and on our farm, but also to communicate with the policymakers that are in this room in DC making a change for us at the policy level, then we will be able to effectively look at the future in an optimistic light. As long as that question continues to be asked to farmers, and the question is, what do you need as a farmer, as a grower, as a rancher? How can we help you on the policy side? And that communication is open. I feel very optimistic about what I can do on my ranch, not only from the business perspective and for the local economy and community, but how I can be a player in feeding the people and the animals and the ecosystems around the world.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. I really wish we could just take your optimism and bottle it and spread it around like fertilizer. One of my heroes, General Colin Powell, once said that optimism is a force multiplier. And he meant that in the context of warfare, but it certainly is true in the context of business as well. Amy, I wonder if I could turn to you, because this panel is meant to talk about local to the global or the domestic to the international, and you have an awful lot of experience organizing conferences for the national FFA and whatnot. And I suspect in that environment, you spend a lot of time talking to a lot of people in the agricultural sector, particularly young people. And as you do so, how do you think about why the issue of food security elsewhere around the world should be on their minds as they're working in their farms in Nebraska or Ohio, or trying to think through, frankly, their own productivity and their own livelihoods and their own businesses?
Sure. Thank you for your question. I think that in the realm of youth programming, we've kind of historically thought of food security through the lenses of educating consumers and empowering producers. And speaking to that, educating consumers, being about making sure that consumers have the availability to make choices about the food systems and the products that they're purchasing and distributing to their families to eat. Making sure they have those choices, and making sure that when they have those choices, they have the information available to them to make sure that that is an informed choice they're able to make, whether that is meaning that they have enough food on the table, or whether that's a conscious consumer who wants to use their purchasing power to contribute to sustainable food products. We've also talked about it in the concept of educating producers and making sure that we're making investments into both the public and private sector, and through cooperative extension programming and other types of programming, that producers have the information available to them to not only access basic agricultural production education techniques, but also we've seen today on this panel to have access to emerging economies to market their products, to have access to emerging innovative technologies. And I think within these movable systems that we've kind of identified in youth programming, they really work together in a feedback loop. In youth programming, and specifically in the National FFA organization, and through other organizations like Farm Bureau, in previous years, we focused a lot on the power of telling our story. And we had an amazing solution session yesterday on the power of storytelling and on this human connection that we all kind of seek, and how change happens through these conversations. And in youth programming and in the National FFA organization, I saw a lot of students that were given wonderful opportunities and were just amazing at telling their stories about where they came from and what they experienced as agriculturalists. But I think something that was missing was that, in my experience in agriculture, I have experience in a very distinct lens of agriculture. If agriculture is a larger picture, if global food security is a larger picture, my experience growing up on a small farm and working in youth programming and now working in law is a very small picture of that. And we've heard other programmers and panelists today talk about the importance of making sure that you're not just talking to people who agree with you or have the same experience as you. And so I really think to make sure that we are engaging global consumers and producers, we need to be making sure that we're looking around the room in these conversations that we're having and seeing if everyone is looking at this issue of global food security through the same lens. I think today we've seen all kinds of lenses. We've seen entrepreneurs, we've seen impact investors, we've seen farmers, we've seen youth, and that's important. But in every room that we're in, when we're having these conversations, we have to make sure that those voices are at the table. And with that, I heard in a panel today the importance of listening. Telling your story is important, but listening to others, I think, is more important because people don't want to hear your story and why you think that global food security is important if you're not listening to the person who is actually needing food. And so I think that with these tools, making sure that we are listening to other lenses, checking our own lenses, making sure that we're listening as well as telling our stories, and investing in youth populations, we should be incredibly optimistic. I completely agree with Kelsey. We've seen through the Chicago report that the emerging youth population, while incredibly, it's fast coming and it's producing very quickly, these youth are the most entrepreneurial-minded generation that have ever existed. People call them the purpose generation. And as far as it goes to why we should be putting global food security at the forefront of U.S. domestic policy, we've seen that economic investments in agriculture pay off and eliminate poverty at twice the rate of other economic investments. And I don't know what could be more strategic or advantageous or encouraging than investing in this youth population.
Thank you. So, Tippy, if I can ask you, Amy talks about the importance of lenses and looking at this problem from, obviously on the one hand, hearing everybody's voices, but also understanding it from a common perspective. Trade is a wickedly challenging problem in this perspective. So we've just heard Undersecretary Kenny talk about the value proposition of trade for the American farmer. And as someone who's the president of the American Farm Bureau, it certainly is true in terms of the ability of our farmers to export abroad. But the flip side of this issue of food security is that as agriculture grows and becomes more efficient in other parts of the world that are currently recipients of American agricultural products, two things certainly will happen. One, there'll be less demand abroad. And secondly, they'll also be asking for reciprocal access to our markets to be able to export. And I'm wondering from your perspective, speaking for the American farmer as a business, as a sort of collective, how do you think through on the one hand, the promise of American leadership in food security and also American leadership in agricultural trade, but also the issue of competition that is inevitable, and how do you create a win-win in that space?
Sure, our farmers are some of the best farmers in the world with some of the best technologies that we have at our fingertips, and we can compete with anyone in the world. So we don't really look at it as competition. The way I would like to say that we'd look at it is that, you know, if we raise their standard of living, regardless of whether they just have a job or whether they're farming or whatever, we raise their standard of living, it creates a new market for us, or a market that can afford to buy our products, and that's a really good thing. So they're doing better, they have a better style of living, they're willing to buy protein, we can grow it and we can compete with the world, and we can provide it for them. So that is a very positive thing for us. And the food security, you know, I've talked to generals and they talk about, you know, when you have a country that doesn't have food security, it can be a very dangerous place. And even in the military, they'll tell you how valuable the production of agriculture and the ability for us to produce, how valuable that is to trying to keep the world safe.
Thank you very much. So now I'd like to turn to the audience. So let me suggest a few things. First of all, this is an incredibly friendly panel. So you don't need to be afraid of asking them questions. Secondly, so when I teach at the university, one of the things I strongly encourage is gender equity in questioning. So I'd like for both ladies and gentlemen to please feel free to ask questions, and in particular our young people. So if you're a college student or high school student, you're a missing class for a reason. So please feel free to ask a question. So if you please just raise your hand, and my colleagues with the microphone will find you. So please state your name and your question. And please make your question a question. If you have difficulty turning your statement into a question, I'm more than happy to assist you in that regard.
No, thank you. My name's Ed Katarakis. I'm with CNFA, Cultivating New Frontiers in Agriculture. I don't have a statement. I have a question. The question is, in terms of exporting commodities, the U.S. has been very strong. But what is the potential for exporting agricultural technology? And is there a platform in the U.S. where we can turn as international development specialists to look for new American-bred technologies to export and use in the world?
Maybe, Zibi, I can turn that to you. So not only the export of commodities, but technology, and frankly, is there a business model for doing that beyond simply the sending off of technology as a matter of sort of humanitarian or development assistance?
So I can't really tell you whether it's a business model. They very well may be, but I do know that there's a lot of our technologies that's being carried to other parts of the world, especially around Africa. When I was in Georgia, President Georgia, a lot of the technologies and the breeding of peanuts was being spread into Africa, a lot of different same environments. So I think that there's a lot of sharing going on. Whether there's a business model where we can actually make money by doing that, I can't answer that question, but I think the universities, land grant systems, and some of our commodity groups are already doing some of that at the current time.
Anyone else like to take that question? So,
I think we do rather well in that respect, but perhaps we do not have really the products for the smallholder farmer, which exist in South Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's an area, I think, for American entrepreneurs to look at those needs and see if we can provide some of that technology. When it comes to electronic technology, communication technology, we do very well. And of course, that's a major market now in the developed world. But I'm thinking about things like small tractors and areas that have very small land holdings. We need to look at that potential market because it's important that we get our best technology in their hands too.
And for there to be a business model, first we've got to create the business. So if they started using what we're shipping over there now through our land grants,
right,
and create the opportunity to be able to buy, then there may be a business model to be able to sell our technologies.
is there another question, particularly from a lady in the audience?
I'll add to that while we wait for another question. One thing that you can do to try to target that is to task some interns, some young, creative-minded people with how to address that. And you'd really be amazed when you equip youth with the opportunity, the tools that they'll provide you with.
Thank you. So, yes, ma'am.
Thank you for the panel. Great presentations. My name is Asma Latif. I'm with Bread for the World here in Washington. My question is about hunger in the United States and how, as you all know, there's a high percentage of people in the United States who are suffering from hunger, and many of those live in rural areas here. Mm-hmm. How does that affect the way people think about global food security and U.S. investments in global food security? And also, what can be done to address hunger issues in rural areas here in the United States?
Amy, maybe I can ask this question of you. So how can you really be thinking about global food security, global hunger, when you see hunger in your own local community? And what's the connection?
Sure. So I grew up in an area in Arkansas, in a very rural area, where I think our most recent statistics say that 1 in 4 children are growing up hungry. And in lots of grocery stores, there's not a lot of options for fruits and vegetables. Consumers may be driving over an hour to get to those grocery stores. So that certainly is a prevalent issue. And I think the way that I think about that is to think that global food security doesn't just mean global food security, it means security at home too. And we address that through, I think it goes back to kind of what you were saying earlier, is that it's so important to be investing in global food security on the domestic policy level, without forgetting that we also have those issues here at home. And I think that also goes back to kind of the things that I've been thinking about of why listening is important, because a lot of times we want to take these solutions that we think we have and go impose them on someone without asking them what the problem is. And like Kelsey was saying earlier, we have tons of room to grow in the United States, and specifically where I live and work in the American South, as far as poverty and food security goes. And so I don't necessarily think that we're experts in this realm. I think that we need to be looking at best practice models and investing in our local communities to make sure that we are taking care of those at home as well when we're talking about the context of global food security.
So this is actually a really interesting point. If I can go, we have an interesting question from online. The first is for each of the panelists. So how do each of you define local in the context of food policy? So, Amy just sort of talked a little bit about this. So, Doug, I wonder if you might sort of, pass it on to you. Didn't mean to stump you. But How do we think about local in the context of food policy? So do we mean local by our own county, local by our state, and particularly in this context of a global market for food? What does local really mean to anybody anyway these days?
So I think it really, is up to the individual what they consider local. We have a locally grown purchasing place in my little county where I'm at, and I see the commodities there, and I know they're not grown local being within the county, but they would be in the region of the country. It would have been grown there. So I really think that's a personal definition that someone has to describe. I think really and truly in this day and time, we have a great opportunity in agriculture because we have people that want to know where their food comes from.
Right.
And they really want to know the farmer that grew it. And that's a huge opportunity for us to tell our story. And more and more, we're trying to teach our farmers to be transparent, tell their story, teach them how to tell their story. Because Farm Bureau is not just about policy and advocacy for agriculture. It's about building leadership and developing God-given talents in young people so that they can tell their story and so they can advocate. And it makes them feel powerful and more encouraged to stay on the farm.
Kelsey, do you want to address that?
Yeah, for me, I'm thinking about local from the food grower's standpoint, right? So is the sale of that food making an impact in the local economy? And to me, it's where the economic dollar falls and the impact that it makes as close to that food source as possible would be local to me. And so as we're, once the food is on the table and it's being consumed, it's reached its benefit there. It is providing somebody with nutrition, but is it also providing that food grower with the economic benefit within its community as well? That's the question I think of when I try to identify local foods.
Thanks. Doug, do you want to take it?
As you know, we have a huge growing number of farmers markets around the country. It's not just an urban phenomenon. You find them in every small community, every county seat town really today, and it is providing a direct way for farmers who are producing food to get to the consumer. It helps in terms of their knowledge of where it comes from. It also helps, obviously, the local economy. You mentioned Bread for the World. I was pleased to serve a 4-year term on Bread for the World's national board, and of course they do focus on the local and national food issue problems too. And those congregations, those Christian congregations of a variety of denominations, oftentimes supplement the kind of food bank assistance in addition to the national federal programs providing some of the needs. And indeed, in the very small communities, even in agriculture areas, sometimes those people have the greatest food insecurity problems. So it is not an urban problem, it's an urban and rural problem. And thank you for what you do.
Thank you. Is there another question from the audience? We'll go to another question online. So I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to add to it. So the question online is, quote, can the U.S. change policies that hurt farmers overseas and not hurt American farmers? Is it zero-sum, end quote. What I think this question is getting at are things like subsidies for things like sugar or soy or corn or whatever, particularly when there are other parts of the world, particularly other developing parts of the world, that would like to be able to compete in the U.S. market, but simply cannot do so due to these sorts of policies. And Congressman, I wonder if from your perspective, having served in Congress, what are the various, how does one find the appropriate balance for, on the one hand, policies to ensure the sustainability of our own agricultural sector, while also being mindful of other sectors, particularly those in developing countries?
Well, I'm sure you must have been paying attention to Senator Corker's comments today. He was outlining very specifically what we can do to provide some additional farm products moving abroad and the better use of monetization on the delivery of food from local sources as well as American sources without this huge subsidy to a maritime union that serves no national purpose. It is a continuing fight in the Congress. I have been on the losing side of that for some 20 years. but hope springs eternal in his mind and in my mind. Eventually, we're going to change that policy, and in fact, we're going to have a better use and benefit for American farmers by the use of those resources. I do think there are some subsidies that continue to be damaging to foreign markets. It is true to some extent of sugar, there's no doubt about it. Some people have said that is a major issue that is affecting the Caribbean, has for some time. But we are not alone in this one. This needs to be an international effort because our subsidies were really countering what was coming from the European Union at that point. So this is an issue that we ought to address as developed countries, not just as the U.S. approach.
Yes.
So I would tack onto that I would challenge, if you looked at subsidies across the world, even in undeveloped countries, they're heavily subsidized. I've heard Mr. McKinney talk about how difficult it is to do trade in India because their farmers are being subsidized there. The problems we have in China right now is the high subsidies the Chinese farmers have. I've heard European Union farmers say without their subsidies, they would not be able to farm. And I actually saw a chart of their subsidies. It's something, their policy similar to our Farm Bill, where only less than 20% of the money in Farm Bill goes to farmers. And over 80% of it goes to nutrition and feeds people, which, you know, we're all for. In Europe, it's just the opposite, where there's a little bit of money going to feed people and there's a huge amount of subsidies. So the subsidies in America compared to across the world is really small.
Thanks. So the next question from online, again, I'm going to read it and then add a little bit, is, quote, what's the best program for supporting youth interest in agriculture in the U.S., end quote. I am sure the question did not mean to try to stoke a rivalry between 4-H and FFA. So I'm not going to make you pick which one. But what I will ask is, so because we have panelists with deep experience in both those, what is happening in both of those organizations that you can talk about, to all four of you, with regard to this upcoming generation of farmers? And then secondly, is there anything that is particular about this next generation, whether it be regard to social media, access to state-of-the-art satellite imagery that you can get on your sat phone, any other sorts of things that are really fundamentally different generationally now than from previous generation farmers that can help encourage more young people to engage in agriculture?
I would say that I am going to touch on that question. What's the best program? The best program is any program. Implement something in your community that youth can get engaged in, and you'll be amazed at how the entire community gets behind it. The quickest way to get somebody excited about agriculture is to get a kindergartner excited about agriculture. Their older brother, their older sister, their aunt, uncle, grandma, grandpa, they quickly get excited about that little tomato plant that you sent home with the kindergartner. It's amazing at how it's a simple solution is to pull the youth in, and it's one of the quickest solutions, but to me, any program that exists that is promoting the professional development skills or sharing access to opportunity with our youth is the best program.
I would add to that by saying that successful youth programs are programs that invest in youth by showing them they have opportunities if they are capable of doing very, very, very good work, and by empowering youth with responsibility. We've seen that this emerging youth population is the purpose generation. They want something to work for. They want to make sure that what they're doing means something. And I've identified with that in my professional interests and in my education, and I know Kelsey has as well. And I see youth programs that are innovating with contests. Like, for example, National FFA continues to add career development events and leadership development events that reflect the realities of the current industry. I see other youth organizations, not even necessarily affiliated with agriculture, but innovating with agribusiness competitions, with coding, teaching students to make apps. There are tons of programs called Variations of Girls Who Code that empower young women to code. And I think by tapping into those youth programs, even if they're not necessarily targeting agriculture, programs that are targeting technology and entrepreneurship, we can include those programs into the conversation because they're all working towards that shared picture of food security.
Zippy, did you want to come in on that?
Most valuable program is the one that's available to your children. Because in my growth, there was not a FFA there. 4-H was available. I mean, it developed skills in me that I didn't even know I had. My dad knew I had them, but I didn't know I had them. And they developed them to be able to go on and do things that I've been able to do. But youth programs are just so important. In Farm Bureau across the country, we have 2,700 counties with active Farm Bureaus, and a lot of those counties are active in ag in the classroom. A lot of our state Farm Bureaus are active in ag in the classroom, taking agriculture to the classroom under the science and math and all those things that are required by school systems fit in agriculture very well. And to take a third, fourth, or fifth grader and teach them math, science, and all those great things around agriculture and get them interested in possibly a career, it's just an absolute wonderful way to introduce children to agriculture.
I've noticed in my undergraduate university that of the colleges in the university, the Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources have the highest starting salaries, the highest one in the university. And that's because there's so many diverse things in food science and agribusiness and traditional farming and ranching that's an opportunity for the graduates. So people down at the elementary school and in the high schools really need to understand the breadth of opportunities that you have in agribusiness and farming.
Well, did you want to say one more thing?
You know, the biggest challenge we have, I mean, children and young people, millennials, they want to gravitate to agriculture. They want to be part of it. Our biggest challenge is making it profitable. Keep agriculture sustainable in our country and across the world, we have to make it profitable. And we have to get our consumers and the general public to understand that agriculture doesn't stay the same. It changes every so many years. It changes with the new techniques, the new methods, the new technologies. And the thing that keeps me up at night is the people that don't really understand why we do what we do and what the technologies do for us and how it helps us to be better environmentalists, more productive, better quality food. And if they really understand what those new technologies did, they would trust the science. We trust science in everything else in our life, but we question whether or not the science around food technologies are really good or not. The science is there, it's proven, and if they'll give us the opportunity to take the challenges that's in front of us, whether it's drought or whether it's a disease in a plant, and use these technologies, we could make opportunities out of it, and we wouldn't have hungry people in our world.
Science works, and it cures hunger, and that's a great way to end this amazing panel. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. These are our panelists.